Hello, my name is Gerardo Monsegui. I'm from Venezuela. I have been in the oil and gas industry for more than 35 years. In the coming few weeks, I will be sharing some videos to showcase research, petrophysical evaluation workflows, software tips, tool principles, and more. So keep in touch and see you. Bye.
Hi everyone. Today I'd like to share the work I've done on the effect of CO2 gas on the logging measurements and the impact on porosity calculations. The work was done in Malaysia thanks to my colleagues and BASIP from Lab Asia and Petronas to allow me to share this paper that was presented in the last APGCE Congress. Let's see the overview. Several carbonate fields are affected by contaminants such as CO2 and H2S. An early detection can support the operator to adequate the downhole completions and surface facilities to cope with the production of fluids under such conditions. The purpose of this analysis is to understand and interpret the gas CO2 effect on well logs, wireline, or LWD to identify the potential intervals that might contain CO2. To improve the density neutron corrections, hydrocarbons, and for CO2, and propose some parameters to characterize fluids for seismic inversion. The outline, current challenges, typical workflow and calculations of porosity, well log response analysis, gas versus CO2 with some examples, a bit of rock physics, and conclusions. Let's see the challenges. Wells with CO2 gas presence in the reservoirs and other contaminants. Where is the CO2 gas coming from? What is the CO2 gas concentration? Can we detect the presence of CO2 at an early stage before casing the well? How will it affect the calculations? Let's review the workflow to calculate porosity. Several measurements can be used to calculate porosity, bulk density, Newton, sonic compressional transit time, nuclear magnetics. Remember that downhole porosity is not measured with tools, it's calculated using equations as listed here. And those equations needs to be filled in with parameters such as matrix, fluids, and those fluids I'm talking about hydrocarbons, CO2, contaminants. The most common used equation is density. And it's common to find a set of characteristic log responses in front of lithologies and fluids. However, CO2, the range in densities goes from 0.19 to 0.82. I'm coming back to this one, and from transit time is not certain. In terms of Newton, you should be able to work out the excavation effect by calculating the hydrogen index that is used in the equation. Once again, CO2 has no hydrogen, so 0. Similar goes to nuclear magnetics. We need the hydrogen index. Again, CO2 is 0. This is the typical models used by the NMR, the virgin zone, and the invaded zone. Now the invaded zone will have another additional component, which is the CO2. Let's review the models. Here we have the V shell, and then we have the matrix and porosity. Within the porosity, we have the fluids, gas, eventually oil or water. Within the fraction of gas, we have now a new component, which is the CO2. And that should be somehow reflected into these parameters to be able to calculate more accurately the porosity. Now, where is the CO2? The CO2 gas effect on logging measurements can be described as a bulk density will decrease. The value will decrease with gas or CO2. Perhaps a bit lesser is the effect on CO2 since a little bit denser than gas, hydrocarbon gas. The neutron logs, well, there is no hydrogen, so neutron logs will not see any response when the fluid is CO2. The sonic loss will decrease. The resistivity, well, is a non-conductive substance, so the resistivities will be high. For the NMR, again, it will decrease since there is no hydrogens. And the Clay effect for carbonates and plastic is somehow similar. Now, these analyses are based on the density Newton plots, so let's review the responses of the density Newton plots. I have two plots here, two cartoons to show the typical load responses for carbonates and for plastics. So we're talking about a model that has only water and gas. It is understandable to see that the shales we plot somewhere down here, and then the clear lithologies in the case of limestone should fall around here. If it's plastic, should fall closer to the quartz line. Now, when we have gas, hydrocarbon gas in this case, the density will decrease and the neutrons will decrease, creating a shift on the cloud of points towards the upper left. Now, when we have CO2, I found peculiar responses that go somehow in a similar way on the upper left part of it. However, in the presence of CO2, the density will decrease, but the neutron not so much, and I will show you some examples. In terms of plastics, again, the cloud of points is located more or less in the same position, perhaps more bigger cloud of shells. And in the case of CO2 and hydrogen and hydrocarbon gas, the effect is a bit more drastic. The neutrons will decrease so much that it could even be zero in some cases, and we know that hydrocarbons doesn't have zero hydrogens. But we'll see this with some examples I have. Now let's try to understand the CO2. What are the gas properties? The CO2 critical point is defined at 31 degrees, 87 degrees Fahrenheit, and 74 bars, which is roughly 1073 psi. The typical downhole conditions on the offshore basins are beyond this critical point toward supercritical. So basically, we're talking about supercritical state for the CO2, which positions the values of the density around 0.82 instead of 0.19. Let's have a look at some log responses. The examples I'm showing you here is coming from carbonates, and I listed a number of logs to showcase the responses on three different stages of responses, highlighted red and gray as two different zones. So let's speculate on the answers. The gamma ray is low, a little bit of high gamma ray down here. There could be a bit of clays or mudstones. There's an increase in gamma ray here that could be due to a buffer zone. Now, if we look at the resistivity is high, as I said. However, there is a small kick in here from these depths and down that is higher than here. Now, if we look at the density neutron crossover, it's a typical crossover for a gas section. But what happened here? The crossover basically disappears. There is no changes on the invasion process, and we know it's not oil. Similar situation happened when comparing the DT and rho B. I play with the scales to overlay on water. It overlays a little bit on the gray zone and separates on the gas zone, presumably. Same thing happened with the GT and the Newton log. Again, overlay on the water and separates on the upper red zone, and so on. So certainly we can discriminate two or even three different zones in here. Let's have a look at another example. In this example, we took some parameters here to characterize the gas responses on 0.77, and CO2 concentration is around 20%, assuming the CO2 density is 0.81. So if we use a multimineral model to try to define. We're able to discriminate two different type of fluids. Once again, we know that there is no oil, a little bit of dolomitic carbonates down here. But let's see the atypical response of the density neutron on the log plots. It goes from tight, wet limestones all the way up to gas, typical hydrocarbon gas response with a kind of a smooth increase on the response. There is an increase in the resistivity, as I show you. The gray zone is a little bit higher than the red zone. Now let's see how can we control the corrections. One of the ways to control the corrections, hydrocarbon correction, is to try to reconstruct the lithology. So once you apply some corrections and input some parameters, we should be able to get a reasonable lithology reconstructed, assuming that this is fluid substitution, bringing everything into the where it looks like water bearing. Let's see another example. This is another well, again carbonates. The density neutron log response, again very atypical response if you want. There's a very steady slope in here that goes from tight, wet carbonates all the way up to hydrocarbon gas. Bit of clays up here, probably just coming from the top. And then we have the response on the logs, raw data, and lithology reconstructed data using the hydrocarbon corrected. That includes the CO2. Now, if you look at the logs, we check it out, and there is a steady behavior of the neutron. It's not the case for the raw B. The raw B is a bit more active. It goes around from water to a fluid in between, and then we have the hydrocarbon gas. A certain hydrocarbon gas proven sample has been taken there. If we shade these responses and taking into consideration again this atypical response, I split this into three zones shading red, gray, and blue, where blue is water. The resistivity drops. And then we have a high resistivity all the way up to what it looks like the hydrocarbon gas, and then something in between. This fluid is what I'm calling potential CO2. Again, we can see the small increase in resistivity. Now, let's see how an example of a well that doesn't have CO2. The previous example I showed you has 20% of CO2. This one has no CO2, and it has a typical gas response where the cloud point goes up left. But not only that, we also look at the density and neutron behavior. So if we take the baseline down here on the water zone, and then we can see how the crossover, the neutron becomes a bit more active, creating a crossover typical of the gas response. So now I put some responses together on several samples on wells with CO2 and without CO2. On the left-hand side, these four plots are coming from wells with no CO2. On the plots on the right-hand side, at least 10% of CO2 and more. All these plots are coming from carbonates, except the last one. I brought one example from plastics. Now let's notice the behavior. Again, as I said, this is a typical response of the shifting of the cloud point toward the top left as the typical response of the hydrocarbon gas. Now, if we look at the steady slope when we have the CO2 in carbonate, this is very typical. Check it out, it's coming from different wells. So this is already telling us something. In plastics, the typical response again on the upper left is coming up, however, when we have CO2, and this particular well has a very high percentage, has 75% of CO2. The log response goes almost even close to zero. Going beyond this, I went to the rock physics. Three row physics attributes can be used to determine the properties: lambda rho, mu rho, and VPVS. So by analyzing the plots, and let's zoom in into these plots to check what is happening here. Here we have the plot coming from the well that has potential CO2, and this well doesn't have any CO2. This plot is basically showing us what is the fluid behavior using now rock physics parameters. Up here we have the transit time versus VPVS. We have, let's go to the hydrocarbon part of it, which is clear. You have the water and you have the gas perfectly separated, while here we have all the three colors together, the blue, the gray, and the red. We know the red is gas, but the gray points are falling on the water points, but we know that there is no water, the resistivity is high. Now we observe the lambda mu plots. Again, we can set a cutoff down here to discriminate between this fluid that seems to be gas carbonates and the potential CO2, which is overlaying in the zone where it should be actually water. We can see on the right-hand side, in wells that doesn't have any CO2, again, we can characterize the cutoff down here for gas carbonates and the water zone. So this should be able to help us to go beyond on the next level and try to plug in these parameters and use seismic inversion with the possibility to detect CO2 areas using seismic. Conclusions. The well-locked interpretation on wells with gas and CO2 represent a very meaningful support on understanding fluid distribution within reservoirs. Real-time monitoring can be applied to identify potential CO2 zones and thicknesses. Porosity and lithology. The porosity computation has improved. The challenge to a successful interpretation relies, of course, on several conditions, among others, mud invasion. If we have very large invasion, then probably there will be a masquerade behind the responses that we want in order to understand what is the fluid's behavior. Certainly, this procedure requires a good understanding of the fluid columns. Recommended set of logs that includes NMR, especially for clastics. The well should be drilled with water-based mud to minimize the effect of the filtrate on the calculations. That one can be quantified by the SXO. Gas monitoring should be done frequently, as they actually do, but they should include the percentage of CO2 when drilling so that we can correlate the results with the log data. Lastly, fluid samples are various depths, and precise disk cutting analysis will help to minimize the uncertainties. That's all I have for you today, folks. Thank you for being here today. See you next time.